Dale Little here at Rescue America Ministries, and we're picking up in Daniel chapter 8, and we're going to continue to study there. Just a couple of dates I'll set out there that you might want to keep in mind for the book of Daniel. Rome was founded as a kingdom in 753 BC. It later on became they defeated the Etruscans, and about the same time they became a republic in 509 BC. During that time, or between that span, in 587 to 509, you had Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, Nabonidus and Belshazzar, and then Cyrus came with the Persian Empire, and then all these other things going on with Rome, who was out of the picture right now as far as the Promised Land goes. But they will come into the picture. And so we'll see that in 331 BC that Alexander defeated Persia, and he was leopard with 4 wings, and he's also he's a he-goat, the male goat that we talked about. So let's go on here. He came against the king of Persia. He had a hatred for the Persians because the Persians twice had invaded Greece, and a lot of Greeks died. They destroyed the city of Athens. It says in, let's pick up in, talked about his wrath in verse 6, and then verse 7 says, I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. And then the goat became exceeding great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now, how do we know that this is Alexander for sure, and that it was the Medo-Persian Empire? Well, we know because later on, I think it's on down about verse 20, somewhere there in the same chapter, that Daniel begins to inquire of the angel standing before him, and he wants to know, understand these things. And so the angel identifies these 2 as Greece and the Medo-Persian Empire. And so that's the way we know. Sometimes you just need to keep reading. Alexander the Great had like I say, he had a great hatred for them. The Persians attacked the Greeks in 490 BC, but were stopped at the Battle of Marathon. Then his son Xerxes tried to conquer the Greeks in 480, 479 BC. Athens was destroyed along with other cities, and many Greeks died. And so Daniel had a hatred for them. And of course, as a lot of the Greeks did. Of course, the original beings represented by the 2 horns of the ram had long passed off the scene, which had been Cyrus and Astyages, I think we talked about before. And by the time Alexander came along, there were different rulers by that time. So now we're looking, at more representing the empire rather than just kings. 4 horns talks about there. It came up after the little horn was broken. And that was in verse 8. It says, Then the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. What happened was that when Alexander died, and I'm hesitating because I've caught myself a couple times saying Daniel instead of Alexander, so I think I did it in the last segment, but I caught myself, and so I'm trying to prevent that from happening again. I don't have Alzheimer's, but we talk sometimes about having, some of us have old timers. So anyway, that's the hesitation there. Alexander died unexpectedly after during his battles, and that's one of the things that I've said this before, I'm sure, that I don't admire Alexander's personality. I don't admire his lifestyle. but I do admire his bravery, his military prowess. He was just unstoppable. And of course, that again goes to that God's hand was on him also. But he was a brilliant, but he set by example. He didn't sit back in the back somewhere and just guide his army. He got there in the middle of the battle and inspired. I think that's one of the reasons that the Greeks were so successful, was going with a small army and defeating much greater odds. Is because Alexander was willing to go and show the way and inspire his troops to great things. So the four horns, there were 4 generals that came up that were left, four of Alexander's generals when he died. And they had their own ambitions, of course. And so they soon, after the kingdom was split up among those 4, it wasn't too long until they began to go at one another, and so one of the kingdoms overcame the other kingdom, and so you had 3 left then. Well, that stayed stable for a while, a number of years, and eventually, though, it was overtaken and absorbed into one of the other kingdoms. You ended up with 2. The king of the north and the king of the south of Daniel chapter 11. And that is the very reason that so many people will read Daniel chapter 11 and not even try to continue to understand it, because it's almost, to some people, it's like reading so-and-so beget so-and-so and so-and-so beget so-and-so. And you know how it is that many of us have read the Bible before and skipped through some of those things. And I personally began to find them interesting many years ago, because you see names in there that represent places today, and different things. If you love history, then you notice those things sometimes. And at any rate, we'll see that because of his injuries that they settled on those 4 generals, splitting it up. And we'll see that one of them was the Seleucid Empire, and it was based in Syria. Those are the 2 that was left over time, especially by Daniel chapter 11. That empire was based in Syria, included Babylon and much of the old Persian Empire out towards India and that area, and some to the north, and the old Persian Empire. And then the other was the Ptolemies of the Ptolemaic Empire, based in Egypt. For hundreds of years, Jerusalem had some kind of influence from these 2. And sometimes, most of that time, they were controlled by one or the other. And it went back and forth because Jerusalem was in between these 2 kingdoms. And so sometimes they were controlled by one and sometimes the other. Out of one of them, in verse 9 now we'll go on. Out of one of them, those 4 horns, those 4 conspicuous horns, verse 8, came a little horn which grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven. So we went from, I'll pause just a minute there. It went from one horn. This goat had 1 horn. It was broken and went to 4 horns, and now it's back to 1 horn again. And this 1 horn is, we'll read on, we'll get to that in a minute. It's no longer Alexander the Great, of course. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And the host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Before going any further, we need to understand that this is not the Antichrist again, as I said earlier, because this one comes from the 3rd kingdom, or the kingdom of Greece, whereas the Antichrist will come from the 4th kingdom. And if you want to, break it up in one sense, it'll be the fifth kingdom. If you want to put as the revival of what most people think will be the old Roman Empire, the toes of iron and of clay. Now there's talking about here though. This is not the Antichrist. This is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who ruled the Seleucid Empire from 175 BC to 163 BC, and was a type of the Antichrist. He was a wicked man. I mean, a type of the Antichrist. What more can I say? We see that the Antichrist will come on the scene, and there's some difference of opinion on this. Definitely, by the time you get down to verse 23, we're talking about the Antichrist that is yet to come. But there's some thinks that there's a transition here, it's kind of taking place in these verses as in Daniel's vision. But in verse, it says that some of the stars it threw down in verse 10 to the ground. It probably refers to the Jewish priests. There's always, different thoughts and different ideas on some of these, but I lean toward it being the Jewish priest and possibly some of the nobility of the Jewish people at that time. Whereas the prince of the host could very likely refer to the high priest who Antiochus had killed. It sounds like, the prince of the host, it sounds like a description of Christ, but the last I checked, here it says, it became great, even as great as the Prince of Hosts. And last I checked, God has no equal. Antiochus Epiphanes, the Antichrist will not be his equal, unless it was in Antiochus' own mind. That'd be the only way that could be possible. So you don't need to worry about that. When Christ comes back, it's not going to be... We're not going to be sitting on our seats from heaven looking back down and saying, "Oh, I hope this turns out well. I hope Christ can do this." And it don't go back and forth. It's going to be over once Christ gets involved. We don't need to sit on the edge of our seat and grit our teeth or wondering, "Oh me, what's going to happen?" Now it is going to get bad. I don't want to make light of that. And sometimes we take it too frivolous. Treat it too frivolous, it will be a bad time. But we see that the high priests that were descendants of Aaron, he was killed, and Antiochus just took it upon himself to appoint his own high priest, which was no high priest at all, really. So anyway, it says, I'll make one interesting note here. Hannibal of Carthage died about 184 to 183 BC, when this Antiochus Epiphanes would have been in his early 30s. So it would be highly likely that Hannibal was acquainted with him. Almost certain. After fleeing Carthage some years after his defeat there by Rome, a lot of us don't know this history. I didn't know it until not too awful long ago. Basically, I just assumed that Hannibal was probably killed when Rome defeated Carthage. But that's not so. He was allowed actually to continue to rule or be a part of the governance there in Carthage after Rome had defeated them. Some of his... Hannibal was, by many accounts, he wasn't a godly man. He didn't worship Jehovah God, but he had good principles. And he was trying to clean up some of the corruption of city officials there in Carthage. And so some of them turned him in to the Romans and said, well, he's conspiring with Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, Antiochus III. Excuse me, I get it right. Which was the father of Antiochus Epiphanes. And he was the king of Seleucid Empire at that time. And they said that he was trying to encourage, and he may have been, I don't know, he was trying to encourage Antiochus III the Great these also known as, to attack Rome and go against Rome. And when he found out they had sent to Rome, and Rome was sending a delegation to Carthage, Hannibal decided it's time to get out, because he would have probably been taken back to Rome and in prison. And he actually did go to, under the care, I guess the protection, to say in one way, of Antiochus the Great, and ended up being actually a naval commander and helped fight the Romans one more time at least, and maybe a couple more times. But that's we're not getting into all that. But that's just kind of a side note there. Hannibal, as I said, died about 184 or 183 BC, when Antiochus Epiphanes would have been in his early 30s, and since he, with his father, did fight the Romans again, but this time Hannibal was not a general, he was a naval commander. Maybe Antiochus the Great was afraid to give Hannibal too much power. Maybe he's afraid he'd overthrow his own kingdom. I don't know. Hannibal was one of the greatest generals, much like Alexander the great military general. Those two were two of the greatest. And a lot of people don't know that. We know that Hannibal, most of us, caught Rome by surprise by going around through the Alps, even with elephants, and came in to Rome from the north there, where not expected at all. And they fought a couple of times, and Hannibal, of course, defeated them easily. But then the Romans came with their whole army out against Hannibal, and Hannibal destroyed the Roman army. A lot of people don't know that. At the Battle of Cannae, there's another one you can look up sometime if you're interested in history. The Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal destroyed the Roman army, and but for some reason never proceeded to Rome to actually take Rome. A lot of speculation on why, but we'll not get into all that right now either. But anyway, after fleeing Carthage, he allied with Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great, there. At the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, Antiochus III was defeated by Rome. And so one of the demands of Rome was that they take hostages. And one of which was Antiochus III's son, Antiochus IV, later known as Epiphanes. He gave himself that name. Epiphanes means manifest, God manifested. And so God manifest. And so he gave himself that name, Epiphanes. Again, Hannibal had to flee for his life, because also there's some differences on who won the naval battle, but regardless, the war was lost, and there had to be alliances made and peace treaty. And so one is that they wanted Hannibal. Rome still wanted Hannibal, and so Hannibal again had to flee, and eventually Hannibal once again fled, but was later betrayed, and seeing no way of escape, he committed suicide by drinking poison about 184, 183 BC. In 187 BC, Antiochus III was murdered in a Baal temple near Susa, where he was exacting tribute, much needed now to pay Rome the revenues they demanded. And after his father's death, Antiochus IV's older brother took the throne, but was soon assassinated after he took the throne. And at some point, Alexander IV, Epiphanes, was released from Rome, and then he killed his brother's assassin, and he took over the empire, or kingdom of the Seleucia, even though they're kind of vassals now to Rome, as many others became later on. And so this is like I say, I love history. I hope somebody loves it as much as I do or more, and I hope you get something out of it. Some people I know would be bored by it, but I just find it very interesting. Hannibal, even though he's not mentioned, was very critical to the timing of Rome's intervention and to the birth of Christ. If it had not been for Hannibal holding Rome back, and through God's design, I think the hand of God was on Hannibal just as it was Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus and some of the others that God sent to different reasons, some to bring judgment. But I think in Hannibal's case, it was to hold Rome back so that they didn't come on the scene too soon. And this is one of the things that I said I love about the book of Daniel. One was the practical applications that he purposed in his heart he wasn't going to defile himself. Three Hebrew children decided they weren't going to bow to the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, but also the sovereignty of God, and that's where we see what we see right here is through Hannibal, the sovereignty of God, raising up this man to hold Rome back. Man thinks he's in control a lot of times, and we do know that Satan is called the prince of this world. He's got a certain amount of control, but it's only what God allows him to have. And so God's hands on these different people. That's the reason that it said that the the Medo-Persian Empire, could not be stopped as long as God's hand was on him. But once God's hand was taken off, then nobody could help them. And once his hand's on Alexander the Great, and we know that helped pave the way for the New Testament, because everyone spoke Greek. It just made it perfect for the spread. Roman roads and the Greek language made it possible for the gospel to spread throughout the world. And so God's hand is just in all of this. And his hand was in Hannibal, our own Hannibal, and holding back Rome. But once the timing is right, then Hannibal was taken out of the way. I think history makes it clear that if Carthage had sent Hannibal the reinforcements that he asked for, that Rome would have failed. But then we would not have Rome in charge. When Christ came on the scene and the taxation set up just like Augustus set it up, that they go to their home, and that Christ would be born in Bethlehem just as the scriptures prophesied, just as God had said. And so it all comes down, and we talk about all these great men, these great generals, these empires being unstoppable. God's plan is unstoppable. I can guarantee you that. You're not going to stop God's plan. Satan is not going to stop God's plan. There's times he hinders, in some respects, what we are trying to do and what God's called us to do. Yes, he may provide some hindrance. Look at Nehemiah going to build a wall, doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing, but look at the battle that he had to fight to get that wall built. But it did get built. Tobias, Gershom, all the others, it wasn't going to stop. It was going to get built. And so is everything else that's in this book of Daniel and the Bible itself. It's going to happen just like it says. We just need to understand it, which is not always easy, I'll be honest. But with help and prayer, even someone made a statement, and I'll close with this on this segment. Someone made a statement that Daniel was known for so many years, from the time he was a young boy, to understand dreams and visions and to be able to interpret them. And we'll see as we come down to going into this chapter that Daniel's having a hard time understanding this stuff. Now, we have the advantage because we can look back on history, and I think we'll understand more as time even now moves closer. I think some of us hold some views, possibly me included. I'm not putting myself out there. That we'll see things different than we do today. Now, some things won't. I mean, some things are clear. Well, just a quick example is that we know that here the angel said that the ram and the goat was Alexander the Great and the Medo-Persian Empire. And so that's not going to change. Those things can't change. But things that we kind of speculate on and things like that, we'll see a little more clearly even as time. And I think I'm convinced we're near. We're very close. But I'm not a date setter. I'm not going to set a date. Bible, it's foolish for anybody to do that when the Bible says no man knows. And so I don't know, but there's a lot that we can't know and we can't understand. They're little Rescue American Ministries here in Chesnadia, Romania.